Senator Tom Cotton, who had put out a tweet regarding some of the protests that have pro-Palestine protests that have shut down roadways, including the Golden Gate Bridge for some 5 hours. He called on people to, quote, take matters into their own hands with regard to these protesters. And then when asked to clarify whether he was serious about violence directly against protesters exercising their First Amendment speech rights, he doubled down in an interview with Fox News. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
I agree with you that you have to get to these criminals early. If something like this happened in Arkansas on a bridge there, let's just say I think there'd be a lot of very wet criminals that have been tossed overboard, not by law enforcement, but by the people whose road they're blocking. If they glued their hands to a car or the pavement, well, probably pretty painful to have their skin ripped off. But I think that's the way we'd handle it in Arkansas. And I would encourage most people anywhere that get stuck behind criminals like this who are trying to block traffic to take matters in their own hands. There's only usually a few of them, and there's a lot of people being inconvenienced. It's time to put an end to this nonsense.
So skin ripped off, thrown off the bridge, take matters into their own hands. Emily, your thoughts?
So Tom Cotton, I think, is making a big mistake by saying that for, just a pure, let's just talk about the style, the public relations, superficial level right now. If something happens to one of those protesters, Tom Cotton, the finger is going to be pointed straight at him for incitement. I despise the traffic blocking protests. In fact, one of my favorite images from the last year is all of these working class DC residents of all different stripes, all different backgrounds, all different, ethnicities, all of that, just pulling these protesters off one of the major roads here in DC, but they were climate protesters because, nothing violent, but just moving them because I just think it is one of the worst possible ways to protest. I think it is illegal and it's not the best use of civil disobedience. All of that said, two things can be true. It can be a really bad and illegal way to protest without also being something that warrants violence. And something that, gives Republicans any reason to even wink and nod at potential violence. Wasn't it in Panama that someone shot, I think it was a climate protester just last year who was blocking traffic, shot and killed a climate protester who was blocking traffic just last year. So, no, I don't think it's right to play fast and loose with this rhetoric. Tom Cotton obviously served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, I think actually in combat units. And so I'm sure that this is really visceral for him in a way that it's not for myself, but it's still, I think, really, really unwise to be playing fast and loose with that physical, violent rhetoric like he did there, even if it's at least from the perspective of myself and a lot of conservatives, and probably just a lot of people in general, a really annoying form of protest.
You could object to the form of protest without calling for people to be thrown off a bridge and have their skin ripped off. Right. You just did it. And Tucker and I had a whole debate on some of these protest tactics, which, at this point,
Sauger's pro-traffic blocking.
He loves that. No. Here's my thing that bothers me is you have a majority of Democrats and a plurality of independents who are looking at what's happening in Gaza, and this is a genocide. And yet the amount of emotion about that versus some protest tactics that people disagree with coming from Tom Cotton, it's nowhere near equivalent. And the other thing is, we're talking about hypocrisy. I don't remember this amount of upset about the inconveniencing of people, et cetera, when we were talking about this convoy in Canada. What was it called? I can't remember. Freedom Convoy. What was the thing called in Canada?
Yeah, the Freedom Convoy, yeah.
That shut down an entire Canadian city. This was celebrated. They weren't criminals. They weren't, being called for them to be thrown off a bridge and their skin ripped off and whatever. So it's only when it's protests that Tom Cotton disagrees with, that suddenly we hear this language. And, I think he is very credibly the most authoritarian and one of certainly the most pro-war senators which is pretty extraordinary thing to say. I think pretty consistently, his instincts are incredibly authoritarian, crackdown, police state, call in the military to crush Black Lives Matter protesters, et cetera. But that he can say this on Fox News, which is the largest cable news network and, very mainstream in terms of conservatism, with zero pushback. In some ways, I find that to be the most disturbing part of all of this, that the idea that people who are trying to get a ceasefire and end a genocide deserve to be thrown off a bridge because you disagree with their protest tactics. Yeah, I've got a problem with that.
And I think, by the way, that's one of the reasons that this is just it's kind of a tangent, but I think that's one of the reasons why people like you and Sagar and Ryan and me and all of us can sit down and have these conversations is that we understand that there are legitimate reasons, that people have real reasons and real arguments as to, if you believe something is legitimately a genocide, then why would you not be blocking traffic? That people have real reasons to do what they're doing that are rooted in principles, and we might disagree with them, and we might find them, abhorrent, or we might, disagree with the sort of ends or the way people justify those ends. But you kind of understand that people have their principles. Just like, by the way, the warmongers had their principles of supporting the Contras in the 1980s. People have deeply held beliefs, and they act on those deeply held beliefs. And the best way to come to consensus that serves everyone and to seek justice is to debate it, and to have a country that allows for that debate to be aired out. So, yeah, really unfortunate decision, I think, from Tom Cotton yesterday. And, Krystal, there's more bad news, really, for the fate of protesters around the country just coming out of the Supreme Court yesterday.
Yeah, so this is maybe the most significant thing that happened. I know we've done a world tour of censorship attacks on the First Amendment, but honestly, this may be the most significant. Put this up on the screen. So the Supreme Court, this is the headline from Vox, effectively abolishes the right to mass protest in 3 U.S. states. That would be Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. So basically, the Supreme Court decided to allow a lower court decision to stand. And that lower court decision stood with a Texas law that criminalized a Black Lives Matter protest organizer because something illegal happened at his protest that he helped to lead and organize. This is D. Ray McCassin, who very well known Black Lives Matter organizer and activist leader. So the idea here isn't that D. Ray himself did anything illegal, or even that he incited anyone to do anything illegal. The idea is that he created, by even hosting this protest where something illegal and violent happened, that he himself is culpable and can be found criminally liable for those acts of these random people at the protest. I mean, this is insane. And the reason that, the Vox article, I think rightly says this effectively bans protest in these 3 states as long as this decision holds. And like I said, it's not that the Supreme Court made a decision, they allowed this to stand. So there may be a decision down the line that overturns it. But you can imagine if you are responsible for the actions of every single random person who happens to show up at your protest, you could also have bad actors who just want to get you legally in trouble, who show up and cause mischief, knowing that the blame can be pinned on you. So who's going to want to risk that type of criminal liability when the stakes are so extraordinarily high as, currently this Fifth Circuit decision is the law in much of the American South?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is just, so the Supreme Court declining to hear this case is one thing. It's now being kicked back to the lower courts who could still sort of come to a question on this. And it's about sort of the vagueness of a statute and there might be really legitimate legal questions. Actually, clearly there are, because it's ping-ponging back through the court about how to interpret something. And it might be the case that a law needs to be changed in order to prevent the legal confusion here, because there should be no legal confusion. A person who organizes a protest should not be able to be held liable for any violence that happens. And the argument is that DeRay McKesson was organizing what was, from the outset, by design, an illegal protest, but we're talking about then civil disobedience, and that doesn't mean you can't have civil disobedience without the violation of laws, which means there are laws that you're violating. Civil disobedience is that's the concept of it, and so if we're going to virtually make it completely impossible by holding people liable for things that others do, that's a sad day. But I actually expect that as this ping-pongs through the lower courts, someone's going to figure out that a law needs to be changed. Maybe I just have more faith in the system, but I think both sides obviously benefit from protests at this point. Everyone knows that. So I don't know. I mean, we're about to talk about a Supreme Court case involving January 6th defendants. And so I just think there's heightened sensitivity about this, and we're going to have a better outcome eventually. The sad thing is that, justice delayed is justice denied, and it might take too long to get to that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, Donald Trump used a lot of language on January 6th that could be seen much more directly as incitement than anything DeRay McKesson is, even alleged to have said on that day. They're not even saying like, oh, he incited this. That's not even part of the argument. But can you imagine the reaction if Donald Trump was found liable in some ways for people who did assault police officers, not because he incited it, but just by being involved in the organization of the protests? I think the right would probably have something negative to say about that.
Yes, I mean, Ginny Thomas and the sort of organization of buses for people to march in D.C. on January 6th, there was an original protest that was planned to be peaceful, and I talked to tons of people that day that were there they had no idea that there was anything that was going to spiral. They were there to see Trump's speech, and they were there to make their presence known just in D.C. and weren't planning to go into the Capitol. They didn't even know that was on the radar. But there were people that supplied resources to that original protest that could easily, with really problematic interpretations of this law, be, if D.C. had similar language, could be brought up on charges like DeRay McKesson. So hopefully this has opened up all of our eyes to the dangers of that, because, conservative protests and conservative, I guess, riots like January 6th was, just not something that a lot of conservatives had to think about in the past. And they are now thinking pretty hard about it. So let's hope we can come to some good legal consensus on this question in those states, because there's no way that can stand. I mean, it's wildly wrong.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.